Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And I guess we're kind of continuing along our line of the evolution of media in gaming. And a very important piece of media that's not the games themselves, but kind of is all the old gaming magazines.
Yeah, there was a time I guess it was in the 90s that at least I first started getting them pretty regularly, where, like in every other entertainment field, magazines were the main way to get information.
It was the quickest.
It was the quickest. Everyone was subscribed to something that came in the mail. GameStop had bought their own gaming magazine. Game Informer, I think, existed separately, and they shortly bought it and made it part of their sales pitch.
It still exists. I am a subscriber.
There was Nintendo Power, which was Nintendo's big gaming magazine, which featured comics and ads and game strategy guides and all sorts of stuff. There was EGM, Electronic Games Monthly. There was once the Xbox came around and PlayStation, they both had their own magazines, PlayStation Magazine and Xbox Magazine.
There was Game Pro and Game Fan.
Game Pro and Game Fan.
There was official PlayStation Magazine. There was Sega had a magazine as well,
right?
And
yes.
I'm trying to remember exactly what it was called. It wasn't Sega Power. It wasn't Sega Visions.
Sega Visions.
Visions. I caught on to that and subscribed to it when they were on their last two issues. So I always wondered why the hell I didn't get more of them, but I got the last two issues of it, and I mean, then there's also all the computer gaming magazines. There was, and I mean, we're just talking about the American releases. And there's dozens more that even just stateside that I can't remember right now, that if we pulled up a Wikipedia page, it would be so much of oh my God, that one. And oh yeah, this one. And now there's really none. Game Informer still exists.
And I think Game Pro might. I don't remember. But yeah, for the most part, a lot of them gone extinct or gone digital. You know, most websites and most magazines in general exist digitally and sometimes in print. Like your Wired magazine exists both in print and digitally, and there are others.
Yeah.
But back when Geoff and I were younger, for those who don't recall the olden days, you would pay for a magazine subscription and get it. Usually it was an issue a month. Some magazines were every other month. It depended really on when their release schedule was. And then, these magazines would come sometimes with demo discs because you couldn't download demos before you were connected to the internet. Not all consoles were always connected to the internet.
And demo discs are something I want to talk about on another episode. We'll gloss on them here, but they are a particular interest of mine.
Yeah, it's just fascinating the collection of games you would get or the games you would buy to get games. Like right now, getting a demo is so non-spectacular because you just sign online, and if there's a demo, you download it.
Yeah, super easy.
Whereas I still remember the reason 90% of my friends, and we've mentioned this before, bought Brave Fencer Musashi, which was a great game.
Fantastic game.
But was for the Final Fantasy VIII demo.
Zone of the Enders sold a lot.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. You were not buying Tobal number 1. You were paying $50 for the Final Fantasy VII demo.
Yeah, pretty much. And so, those were things that usually came in packaged. I know Xbox used to do demo discs all the time of the Microsoft specific releases that were coming out in the coming months and things like that. But these magazines also served as a purpose, besides being like any other magazines, a source of news. It also had hints and tips, comics. There was a famous comic character in Nintendo Power called Nestor, who would often do game parodies and kind of be a voice of the fan. He was very much just a gamer kid personified. These magazines they were rich with information, kind of stuff that we just kind of tend to go to Tumblr for now.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I still actually, I don't have as big of a magazine collection as I used to have, but I cut out things that I really enjoyed and put them in a binder because I am super cool. And I have several, probably about tens of issues of Sue and Chan from EGM.
Sue and Chan, I remember them too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've got those. The comic adventures of two over-the-top game developers.
Yeah, essentially it was that magazine's answer to Nestor and the like. It was another kind of parodying, goofy comic that was very comical.
Yeah. And Nintendo Power, actually, in addition to Nestor and Howard, and also Nestor crossed over into games. They made Nestor's Funky Bowling for the Virtual Boy.
That's right.
I'm sure we all played plenty of Nestor's Funky Bowling for the Virtual Boy.
Just you, Geoff. Just you.
Let me have this. and on the flip side, there were also a lot of comic adaptations of games at the time. There was a full story of Super Mario World that was made in comic form that was released serially through Nintendo Power and was
That's
then
right.
collected. There was a comic series of The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, which was then collected. And I know they were collected because I have them.
Yeah, some of my favorite Nintendo Powers were actually, and my favorite thing about Nintendo Powers were the cover art, because they got very creative. I'll still never forget, I can picture it every time I think about it. The very first Nintendo Power magazine was for Super Mario Brothers 2, and it had claymation, like they made clay models and photographed it, and that was the cover. And it just looked so cool, because it was the first time ever Mario was in 3D. It was the first time he was actually ever in physical space, because there were no toys at the time. There were no, tchotchkes. It was just
there were
this
drawings,
magazine.
but yeah, you're right.
And so that was always something that really stuck with me. But the thing I loved about these magazines also is that, for the most part, you could get unbiased reviews of games as well. And Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation would play favorites a little bit, but then you had things like EGM where they were pretty brutal with their reviews. If they didn't like something, they let you know.
They let you know.
And those magazines were just, that was how you found out about whether games were good or not. That, or you bought them and spent the money and then wasted the money.
Mm-hmm. No, and I remember GamePro in particular, which was my magazine of choice at the time. I grew to understand different reviewers' tastes and biases. And because GamePro, nobody would write reviews under their legal name. It was almost like they weren't quite screen names, but they were truly like handles or, nom de plumes, which had little goofy drawings with them. I can't remember any of them except Boba Fett, which had a drawing of like basically the comic book store guy from The Simpsons or somebody with his proportions holding an ice cream cone in a Boba Fett outfit with the helmet off and just a big grin on his face. He was very brutal to a lot of games.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, and we're talking about a lot of game magazines that did, for the most part, focus on consoles. But, PC Gamer and PC Magazine, which were two of the big PC magazines that I believe are still printing today, it was almost like another world to me. As a kid, I always had a computer capable of playing games, but it wasn't until high school and early college that I really built my PCs for gaming. I custom builds. Before that, I had store-bought Dells or compact Presarios that ran games, but not well. And so, I would read up on StarCraft and all of this stuff, World of Warcraft, or even earlier, just Warcraft. And I'd just be so amazed. I still remember when I read the article in PC Gamer for Red Alert, I guess it was 3, Tiberium Sun.
Yes.
Which was the first strategy game I ever was waiting for, because I had been playing Red Alert, the first 2 Red Alerts, since I was younger, and then I heard there's a new one coming out. For those who don't know, Red Alert was a popular RTS back in the heyday when StarCraft was really big and Warcraft was really big, but it was military. It was,
Command and Conquer, then Red Alert, then it was one of those that it kept taking its subtitle and making that the new game.
And it was one of the cheesiest but most fun games, because it was based in reality, but there was some science fiction in it. You had these Tesla coil cannons that would shoot lightning blasts and stuff like that. But it was such a fun game to play, and I remember
it was a good strategy game, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember reading PC Gamer and finding out that was coming out, and I was so excited, and that was it's just, with gaming media now, it's, you can get as hyped, and like the lead up to the Switch, I was sort of hyped and hesitant, as I've said before. But then once I was in with the Switch, all the media I saw on Mario Odyssey got me so stoked. But it was
Mm-hmm.
different when you were reading it in a magazine, I felt, because it was something physical. And
Yes.
like that was the information you had. You couldn't hop on a computer and find out everything you wanted about that thing and watch a million YouTube videos. It was literally, you had to read the same article 3 times just to pull every tiny bit of information out of it.
Mm-hmm. And you couldn't really watch a lot of videos. You could hop on at the time, but you'd be more likely going on to AOL keyword Game Pro, or,
Yeah.
maybe your web browser worked, or maybe that was just me. And you didn't get as much media. I remember very distinctly getting, because I never had a subscription to PlayStation Magazine, but I had a PlayStation, and I saw a cover story for a game series that I recognized from the Nintendo. And it's like, they're making a sequel? Oh my goodness. Tell me more about this Metal Gear Solid. And looking through because it was one of these like white covers that had like a rendering of Solid Snake and Meryl on it. And
Mm-hmm.
looking through it and getting like oh my God, they still kept the cardboard box. And you could first person view through that thing. And like all of these like little tiny screenshots along the top of the page. And like a 6-page thing about the development and about how like absolutely insane the AI on it is, and the reactions to things, and how good you have to be to sneak past all of this stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
like I was hooked. I had no trailers, I had no music, I had no anything. I had these 6 pages, and my God, they got me through. And I was super hyped for Metal Gear Solid for that, and just carried me all the way through. It's we have a much higher expectation now because it's easier to get us those media, and there's greater transparency, not just in terms of media outlets, your Kotakus, your Polygon, IGN, Destructoid, any of those getting you footage and things like that. Various Tumblrs and places show that stuff up, and game developers are on Twitter. We can interface with these people on so many different levels that I'll be an old man for a moment. The mystique is just gone.
Yeah, well, I remember I think it was EGM for sure, and I think
Mhm.
other magazines did it too, but people would write letters to the editor,
Yep.
but there was always contests for envelope art. Like people would draw these awesome pictures on
Yeah.
envelopes,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
would feature them in these magazines, and that's, nobody really writes letters anymore, but it was cool to see these hand-drawn artwork that was for whatever game was popular that month, or just famous characters that people liked, or even sketches of the designers themselves.
Yeah. No. And I mean, again, Twitter, Instagram, people are able to post those things, but it was interesting to have the physical tome to kind of see the collection of them.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
much like we were talking about, like digital versus physical. When you can find everything, you find nothing sometimes.
sure. And I think the thing that, we lost with a lot of these magazines going to digital is, there's there's a sense of inundation when you're on a mailing list. For me anyway, when you're on a mailing list from a website and it's supposed to send you updates and articles, I feel like it gets spammy. I don't read them all. Whereas when you're getting a magazine once a month, like the magazine takes 20 minutes to read, maybe if even, and
I read it on the subway. Yeah.
and it's like 20 minutes once a month. Whereas when it's on the internet, it's constantly updating. There's no break from information. There's this oversaturation of information.
There's
That's
no
exhausting.
prioritizing that goes on. So yeah, you're right. It becomes a whole bunch of white noise.
Yeah, I mean, on the, everybody take a shot. I'm going to mention the Switch. On the Switch, their news feed, at least, you can kind of join channels, and it'll prioritize the stories in those channels, whether it's adventure games or Mario games or Zelda games or games by Sega or whatever it is. And
Mm-hmm.
so that at least allows you to look at it, and you can choose to ignore it. But even still, I feel like with a lot of modern media, like I follow more developers and indie development houses on Twitter than I do major publications.
Yeah.
The only major publication that I follow that I think has only existed as a website is Polygon. For the most part, Polygon has well-written articles that I really enjoy, and I like the staff. A lot of the
Absolutely.
other a lot of the other gaming sources, the one thing they do that I hate, and other YouTubers have mentioned this, so this is not an original rant, but when these gaming magazines take a funny gaming video from YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
but put the black bar on top and bottom with some phrase, and then post it to their YouTube, they still credit the original artist, which is good, at least that the
Yeah.
original YouTuber gets credit, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not getting any of those views. You're getting the views now, and
Mm-hmm.
I always found that very frustrating. And there's a sense of that kind of cutthroat taking in the media now that I feel like wasn't really. I'm sure it was there in the magazine industry,
It was
but
just harder for us to see.
right, there was less transparency, as you
Mm-hmm.
said.
Yeah,
Um,
but yeah, again, both good and bad.
Yeah, and I, again, I wasn't subscribed to all of these magazines, but I do remember being really sad when Nintendo Power ended. Like, I was not reading them as much as I used to. I'd kind of, we were all made that shift to social media. We hadn't really
Mm-hmm.
been reading them, but I was really bummed because it was just this huge legacy, one of the longest running video game magazines in existence, and it ended.
Mm-hmm.
There's good news, though. Recently, I found out, for those who love the Nintendo Power magazine, is Nintendo has started their first official podcast called the Nintendo Power Podcast. I forget who the host is, but it's one of the head designers at Nintendo, Nintendo America, I believe. But it's Nintendo Power Podcast. They talk about games coming out. They talk about what's new in the console market. They talk about new stuff coming to Nintendo from third-party developers, first-party developers. It's essentially the magazine in podcast form. I have only listened to a little bit of it, so I can't pass judgment on whether I like it or not, but I'm definitely intrigued because I had not thought of that until Nintendo specifically made that transition. It makes perfect sense to turn a magazine about all of your in-house inner workings into a podcast. And also conveniently, it's available on the Switch. Take another shot. The Switch, in their newsfeed, you can click on the podcast and listen to it. I haven't checked if you can listen to it while playing something, but you
Mm-hmm.
can definitely listen to it, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, and honestly, it's no, you're right. It's a very natural evolution. Like gaming sites are TV shows or they're TV stations, whereas a podcast is kind of a little more like a gaming magazine.
Yeah.
It's periodically released. It is all in one spot. If you put some nice timestamps on which discussions and articles happen, you have a table of contents. It's really an elegantly perfect evolution of the old gaming magazines. And hey, collecting podcasts isn't going to take up much physical space in your life. So,
That's true.
subscribe to Fun and Games, people.
Right, exactly. And write us a review and rate us.
Anyway.
But no, in all seriousness, I think a lot of what me and Geoff do on the podcast also has been influenced by these media sources. I mean, for sure, if you follow the Facebook page for Fun and Games, give us a like on Facebook. I try and make sure that I post gaming news as regularly as possible, or the occasional fun photo or video, because I want to keep you guys engaged besides just when we're yapping at you. And also, I want to give credit to the other sources that are informing us. We don't claim to be a news show. However, when there is breaking news, we want to talk about it. We try and work it in, like the loot box stuff and so on.
Yeah.
I watch a lot of video game content on YouTube as well. We've
Same.
been no slouches to mention the completionists, the game theorists. I recently started rewatching Extra Credits because I was an old school fan of Extra Credits, and then I stopped watching for a little while, and now I'm watching again. But like, again, those YouTube videos that are informational, your game theory more so, and the completionist a little bit, or Extra Credits, these are either informational where they're teaching me something about the game industry, they're informational because they're teaching me about a game, or they're informational because they're teaching me about something I never thought about in a game. And so gaming magazines did a lot of the same. They'd have article features on specific characters. They would do comics about characters' interactions with other characters from other franchises, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And there doesn't seem to be a ton of room for that in gaming media. Again, I'll go back to Polygon. The reason I like following them is because they'll write articles on a lark just about theories they have, or interesting fan theories, or things that seem a little outside the norm. And I like when a medium doesn't take itself too seriously. And those older gaming magazines seem to do that more, whereas more modern blog and news site style gaming reporting seems to be a little over serious sometimes.
They feel like they need to have the claim to legitimacy to
Right.
do anything. And especially if you've got a smaller group running it, if a group at all, yeah, you've got a lot of work to do. And it's like, all right, I got to make all this serious stuff. But I got to be goofy too? No, screw you. Whereas a larger publication and something where you can craft a monthly product, you got like, all right, you work on this goofy stuff. You've got that, it is a more old school publication. And that business model has absolutely shifted.
Well, yeah, and let's also look at gaming journalism in general. I mean, there was that big backlash when Cuphead first came out. Gaming journalism in a magazine, you take screenshots of the game, but the person writing the article is writing it. There's no video, as it were. But there was a review of Cuphead. I can't remember what site it was on, and honestly, it's unimportant at this point because it was blown out of proportion.
Right.
But the gaming journalist was trying to play Cuphead and kept failing the basic tutorial over and over again, and also wasn't hyper favorable about the game. I mean, he didn't badmouth it by any means, but he talked about his struggle with it and his doubts about it. And people lashed out, hey, this guy can't play games. Why is he writing these articles? And there's a whole sense of politics to that, because you have to think, well, you need a good journalist, but you also need a good gamer. But you can't always have both. And especially if you're trying to run a publication, sometimes stories just get assigned out. When you have 18 first-person shooters and Cuphead coming out in the same month, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, people, the first-person shooter guy can't cover all of those, so he may have to also cover some other stuff.
Yes.
And it's foolish to jump down people's necks now for that kind of ridiculousness. Now, of course, if you know nothing about games and like you're saying that Cuphead's a terrible first-person shooter, well, yeah, because it's not a first-person shooter. But that wasn't what was happening, and it's not so much ignorance as it is, just fanboy entitlement and frustration.
Yes, because we always see the scope that we exist in.
Right.
And the joy of something coming out monthly or something coming out in print form is there's no edits, there's no takebacks, but it's also more spaced out. So there's tons of deadlines, there's tons of insanity involved in that. I'm not saying it was any easier, but it was more contained. Nowadays, you can edit something, you can post addendums, you can everything else. And honestly, you should. And like articles are an evolving thing. Whereas, and I take a certain amount of joy looking back at old video game magazines and seeing where reviews were or what previews said or what the advertising was at the time. But no, when a game comes out and we don't have to wait 2 weeks for the next EGM to come out to tell us about it, we expect reviews on all of our major media outlets 3 hours ago. And people are supposed to get up on this, and who's getting an advanced copy, who's not, who's being, whatever arguments of corruption within games journalism. And I'm saying that with the straightest, angriest face I can. Regardless of any of that, we have an expectation on knowing somebody's feelings on a game immediately. And even more nowadays, like we follow certain personalities or certain journalists. People want to know what Jim Sterling's opinion of a game is. People want to hear what Yahtzee Croshaw has to say, or any of the myriad of other wonderful gaming journalists out there.
Well, and also, like, the thing that frustrates me a lot, too, is it's both a blessing and a curse that we follow these people so closely. Like, you mentioned Yahtzee, who I love. And the funny thing about him being a great writer, and that's more important than necessarily being a great gaming journalist, is that I rarely agree with him. For the most part, his extreme measures of putting down a terrible game, I don't always agree with. Like a game that he would find mediocre, that would be average to me and I'm okay with it.
Right.
But he delivers it in a manner that it doesn't matter. And he knows he's being absurdist. There's no way he doesn't know that.
Absolutely. Very self-aware.
And so it makes it more enjoyable. I mean, you know, I think one of the things that I like about The Completionist is that Gerard, for the most part, is a very passionate, true gamer who really loves what he loves. And when he's not sure about something or he doesn't understand why something's popular, he still gives it the same heart and go than any other game that he knew he loved. And that also translates. When I find a game reviewer who is kind of just phoning it in and doesn't really care about the product, it shows. It's like going to see a play or watching a comedian who delivers a comedy bit, a story that's not true. You can tell he's lying. You can feel it. You can feel it in the energy.
Yeah. They're not invested in it in the same way. And unfortunately, with the amount of games that come out and the staff of gaming media outlets, unfortunately, everybody is going to get stuff they're not invested in and they don't care about. And every game is somebody's favorite game. And so there is a great disservice, quite frankly, in putting so much stock in what is written these days about games.
Well, and there's also just such a dearth of media in general. Like, I'm someone who prided himself on his music knowledge and still does to a certain extent. But looking at new releases just on Spotify and having such an open book of exactly what's coming out, and that's not even 100% accurate because there are indie CDs that aren't always featured on that page.
Yeah.
I use the word CD loosely, but you know what I mean.
Albums.
I still can't keep up. It's impossible to keep up. It's why whenever I hear something I like, I go research it and go down the Wikipedia wormhole. But it's almost frustrating. Like, I've gone on, I haven't been playing the Switch as much, which I've been saying. I recently bought Overwatch, which I fell in love with. It's reminding me of the early days of Team Fortress, just the freshness and how fun it is. And Blizzard knows how to make a good game. Big surprise. But when I went on the Switch today, I had some downtime and I went to the store just to see what's been released. I forgot Bayonetta 2 was being re-released with Bayonetta 1. I forgot that a ton of indie titles were being brought over. A ton of
it's been a good
indie
time.
Titles were coming out. Like, it's impossible to play every game that comes out. There are still like 15 games on my Switch wish list, on my Amazon wish list that I want to play that who knows if I'll ever get to. I'm ecstatic that in March, as we are recording this, it's the first weekend of March, Ratchet and Clank, I believe the new remake version that we've talked about previously.
It's on PS Plus.
It's free. I've never played a Ratchet and Clank game. I'm so excited to download that.
I'm excited to play Bloodborne.
And Bloodborne is also coming out. I've played the Souls games on PC, but I have not played Bloodborne, and so I'm excited to try that as well.
Oh yeah.
But that said, like, again, it's going back to this idea of game journalism informed that, and I'm super excited. But again, I'm only able to play these games because they were sent to me for free because I pay for PS Plus. Otherwise, they would have passed me by like anything else,
Yeah, I was actually about a week ago considering buying Bloodborne. I'm like, how much is it? How much? Glad I waited.
I've been teetering on buying Ratchet and Clank for a while, so I'm excited about that one. But
Fantastic.
To bring this back around, it's the same with any other media. At least with magazines, like, there was an allusion to the release schedule. I'm sure some of the consoles' release schedules, even when we were younger, were still fairly hectic. There was tons of shovelware at the time, and there still is now.
Oh yeah, that doesn't change.
But the reality is there was less transparency, going back to that word. So we didn't know how overwhelming it was. Whereas now, because we have such open access to news and articles and social media and development houses and websites, it's impossible to not know if you just blink. And so it's easy to feel overwhelmed. It's why I jumped ship on Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I haven't really touched it in a while. It's because I just felt overwhelmed by playing games with a story in it, as I've said recently.
Fair enough.
It's why I dove so deep into Overwatch, because I can put on a podcast, open up Overwatch, and play a ton of matches, and then go to bed. There's such. I've hit my saturation point for processing information, and I never felt that way with gaming magazines or any kind of magazine. Rolling Stone when it was physical, which it still is, but most people follow it online.
Exactly.
All media's print media, I felt was more easily digestible. Whereas now, trying to digest my Facebook feed, from friends posting stuff to actual news sources posting stuff to trying to follow things social justice wise on Twitter and retweeting the right stuff, getting really important information out, and then looking at a joke, and it's constant and never ending. And
Well,
so going back to my final point is going back to those magazines, I felt like I was more informed because there was less information, if that makes any sense.
yeah, when the pool is smaller, it's easier. And, well, something interesting that I remember having a discussion with a friend a little while ago, and we were talking about, trying to keep up on social media and everything else. And what he said, like, really hit me. Because this was something he was told. The idea of maintaining a social media page, whether it be Instagram, Twitter, any of that, you are the editor of your own magazine, and you get to decide what kind of magazine you have, the sort of photos you post, the sort of tweets you retweet, the sort of posts you write or reblog. You are creating, when somebody goes to your page, you're sort of creating your own continually evolving magazine layout. And so in an interesting way, the print magazines have sort of, entered the digital highway, digitized zeros and ones, Johnny mnemonic, hoo-ha. The magazines were once in our hands, and now they're in our hands if we want to be really cute about it. And I always want to be really cute about it. And so, this sort of transparency, it's a very dizzying crown to wear.
Yeah.
It's our responsibility.
And I think that's also something that happens when we rely too much on internet media sources versus
Your own friends.
Right,
Or print.
and your own friends. I think it's just so easy to get wrong information, as we can see. It's why things like Twitch and YouTube have become so seminal for gaming, is because it allows gamers to connect with other gamers with very little hindrance.
Yes.
Whereas Facebook, there's algorithms and blah, blah, blah.
Lord, is there ever.
For the most part, straight websites and things like YouTube, YouTube still has an algorithm, but if you subscribe to something,
you're going to get their stuff.
Right, and you can follow it pretty easily, and I've really enjoyed that. Again, most of my gaming news, reviews, and discussions I get from the horse's mouth, so to speak, from the Twitter or YouTube pages of gamers that I trust. That or my friends. Me and Geoff are lucky enough to be part of a great group on Facebook that talks about gaming pretty openly, and they always are sharing helpful information. If they're sharing a review that's not a positive spin on something, it's usually because there's to some purpose. It's not just shitting on something.
Yes, and it's very easy, especially when people are creating their own content on the internet without a journalism degree or anything like that. And that shouldn't be a hindrance, but it's very easy to want to go to one extreme or the other for the sake of entertainment or value, but that then devalues the sense of information and integrity. And you find yourself and this is where people get very up in arms about positive or negative reviews. If you say the wrong word about something you've already got a preconceived notion about, well, that's on you,
right,
the reader, and that's for you to deal with. These reviews are not doctrines of what to play or not to play. Although there is so much that comes out, it feels like it could be or should be, but it isn't. It's just something to go by. And a lot of review scores even note the fact that if it has a slightly lower score, it may not be because it's a bad game. It's because it's a more niche title. You look at it and go, is this a great game for everybody? No. Is it a great bullet hell if you're really into medieval fantasy? Yes. And that is a very narrow niche. But, that might get a 6.5 on somewhere because it's really good, but, it's a little complex or a little much for people, or for those game reviewers that have to deal with 8 games this week and write about them. They don't have enough time to get into it. But people treat them like gospel.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also, to go back to modern gaming media again, there's another YouTuber whose name I haven't dropped yet in this episode, and that's Some Call Me Johnny. And he he does straight up game reviews. He'll give the whole narrative a review, talk about the entire plot for the most part from start to finish with a spoiler warning, and then he'll talk about the game mechanics, and then he'll talk about the sound design, and then he'll give a summation. And when he talked about Sonic Forces, which is the newest 3D Sonic game,
Oh, yeah.
he said it was perfectly average. And he said it in a way that he's like, he was kind of content with, but not jazzed. And for me, I was like, all right, that's good enough. I'd probably play it when it's on sale. And I mean, it started at a pretty low price anyway.
Yeah.
Like, for me, that was enough. Like, I don't need something to be the best game I've ever played ever. Because I played a game that people said that was, and I hated it. And it was Fallout 4. I was so bored with the story in Fallout 4, and it got praise across the board for how innovative it was. And I mean, it had incredible graphics. The gameplay was really tight. It's a Bethesda game, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Like, but that story didn't hook me. And if you're not rating it on narrative, it's not gonna affect your review.
On just the same ways, you got to know what you like and don't like.
Right.
You can, I never, ever liked Halo. I tried. Oh my God, do I try? Like, first-person shooters have really got to wow me on some level besides how good of a first-person shooter they are.
Right.
And that's me. That's genres I prefer. That's trappings of game design that turn me off, turn me on, turn me on to whatever. And, you give something RPG elements, all right, let's start talking. I definitely have a favorable opinion of Borderlands. It's not a game that I come back to time and time again, but it's a game that I don't regret any of the time I spent with it. But again, from the way people talk about it, I have a lower opinion of it.
Right.
And if you were to ask me to review it, I wouldn't give it as great of a score. Because there again, we are talking about an age we live in now where even more so, you really need to see who's on the byline and whose channel it is and whose Twitter is tweeting what, because you need to have that context. And so, whereas when it came out in a magazine, we could sit there, take it in a bite-sized chunk, and enjoy it. Agree, disagree, hem, haw, froth at the mouth, for good or for ill, fine. Write letters to the editor. Please, by all means, they'll print them. But nowadays, it is very much, like I said before, we are on our own page cultivating our magazine, but also in who we follow. We are creating our electronic game fan, which is what we are. And from there, you need to understand where these people are coming from or where they're going. And sometimes we don't have a lot of time to put into games or to whatever else, and we want just the easy answer. But unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. We don't have an easy answer. You've got to... There is no nice staple through the spine. Here it is. The transparency is there, and so it's also a responsibility that we have to follow these things up. And it's also our responsibility to not read the comments, because you're wasting more time.
Yeah, never read the comments. And I mean, but that leads us back also to the entitlement humans have for being humans, this cult of ignorance, and that someone's stupidity is as important as your intelligence, which is frankly just not true.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
important. It's important to note their ignorance and try and educate, but it's not the same thing as someone just stewing in their own ignorance. And that happens with the gaming media too. I mean, things like Gamergate would have never happened in the magazine era because there was just less transparency. But
and a different means for the community.
Right. And this bullshit that there were no female gamers back then is nonsense. There were probably as many of them when we were kids as there are now.
And statistically, female gamers outnumber male gamers now.
Right. Which is also not surprising to me.
Not at all.
It's just back in those, and so on that regard, yes, it is good that we evolved past the archaic medium of magazine, because then there was more transparency. Yes, it was not great for the people who were on the receiving end of it, and that it was a scary time. But the reality is now we're also even more aware of the BS that goes on in our own community than we ever were before. And that kind of knowledge is invaluable. It sucks to go through the paces to get there. And I'm
Yeah.
sure as a white male gamer, I also had some privilege to blind me.
Same.
Whereas I'm sure female gamers of any race and creed didn't have that luxury and were always being persecuted in the gaming community.
Mm-hmm.
And that wouldn't shock me at all. But the fact that I also am now more aware of it and have always been sympathetic to that and wanting to create an equal community for everybody, this kind of information with that transparency allows that to happen and continue to change and shift, which I think is super important.
Yeah, it allows us to form our communities, to find the people that we wouldn't have been able to find otherwise.
Yeah.
The like minds, for good or for ill. And I do come back to the idea that, with all that privilege, all of that, freedom, does come responsibility to fact check, to share the space politely. Because there's ways to talk negatively about something without making it an indictment of somebody's existence or entirety or abilities or whatever.
Right.
We have made and will make bad episodes of this podcast. I am too aware of my own failings to...
Geoff, we're all aware of your failings. It's fine.
Thank you. I try to put them on display as best I can.
But no, of course, yeah. But we also never claimed to be a definitive media source in anything.
From the first episode, never.
Right. From the first episode, we were like, hey, we're guys that like games. And we want to bring on, in the future, other folks who like games. But for now, it's just the two of us yapping about games. And it's also part of why our episode lengths are so inconsistent. Because depending on how passionate we are about a certain topic or how big of a bite we take off of a topic that we can't really handle, we just go. We just go. But the reality is, all I want to do as a fan of games is facilitate other fans of games. We're hitting, and we'll talk about this in a future episode, fanaticism and fandoms are starting to become toxic words because people attach entitlement to that. And I never want this podcast to be about that. I've always wanted, as we are a medium of video game entertainment, I always wanted this podcast to just be a fun way to share stories and experiences that relate to stuff in modern gaming media.
Yes. It's bringing our own lens, our own experiences, which are what we have and which are our truth, to the greater world of things. And not to say that they are absolute truths. They are subjective truths. And you have your subjective truths, and all reviews and all journalism is, even at its absolute best, a subjective truth. And we need to work from there. So.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, plenty of people who have listened have called us out on mistakes we've made, our own BS that they don't agree with. But it's always...
And thank you.
Right, and thank you. But it's always with this want to continue the discussion. It's never to shut us down or to shut themselves down. It's always with this idea of, hey, here's a thing. Let's talk about a thing.
Yeah.
And that's honestly what I want gaming media to be about. And what the magazines felt like is, here is a monologue from this magazine publisher. Please share your thoughts, by writing us a letter. And it's the same idea. It's why I insist at the end of every episode that you guys send us emails or tweet at us or Facebook message us or whatever.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I love talking to Geoff. And if there weren't a mic, we'd probably talk this long about any of these topics.
Oh, no question.
But I like sharing it with the internets as a whole.
Yeah, we want this conversation to be more than just the two of us.
Right. And it has been, thankfully. So many folks who I've shouted out in the past have been very vocal on social media, and we love that. But at the end of the day, I think me and Geoff are creating our own version of what our ideal podcast gaming magazine would be like. The idea that fun is in quotes, because gaming isn't always fun. Sometimes we talk about stuff that isn't fun or that we don't like, and that's okay too.
Or games aren't necessarily fun sometimes, but they're important, or they are good, or they do something. It is seen as a frivolous medium sometimes, but it can cause some amazing moments and amazing movements. And and we want that to be a part of it too.
Absolutely. Thank you guys as always for listening. Please tell us what gaming magazines you were obsessed with. I'm actually really curious to know, because I always feel like everybody had a favorite. I've already kind of let the cat out of the bag, and that mine was definitely Nintendo Power. But like I know my friend Matt, yes, I have other friends named Matt. There were a lot of them.
There are many Matts.
He loved EGM, swore by it. Would always show me new articles in it and stuff. And so I'm curious what gaming magazines really kind of influenced your growth as a gamer. Or tell us you never read a gaming magazine and why. I'd be curious to know that as well. I know a lot of people put a stigma on Game Informer because it was attached to GameStop.
Yeah.
But it was actually not a terrible magazine most of the time.
I know I was definitely a Game Pro guy with other things in there. Thanks to Kieran, I had a big EGM collection for a while, which is where I got all the Sue and Chan from. Even in thinking about it this episode, I'm like, all right, what other ones? I remember there was Edge magazine. There was all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And we know we're never going to cover every corner of everything we talk about here. That's what we've got you for. We want to keep talking about it.
I mean, the truth is we're both really lazy and want you guys to do the real work. I mean, if that weren't obvious already.
Well, we put all this time in. Oh,
I know. It's so much work. Anyway.
I know. But thank you guys so much for listening. Please check us out, retweet. Please leave us a review on iTunes or whatever media you get your podcast from. It would help us out a great deal. Also, if not with this episode starting soon, we're also going to be featured on certain point of view podcast websites. I guest spot with Case Aiken on Another Pass a little bit. I'm on an upcoming episode there. I want to give him a quick shout out as well.
And I would like to also give a shout out to Victor Devon and his podcast We Burlesque, which is going to feature me in a future episode. And I've talked at great length about fun and games there, as well as my involvement, of course, in the burlesque community.
Oh yeah.
I highly recommend it if you like learning about nightlife and learning about burlesque performers, either in New York or outside of it. I highly recommend it. But yeah, and of course, we only beg and plead for ratings and reviews is because it does allow us to get featured. The more rating and reviews we get on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you listen allows us to have a chance to be on the main page. And even if you don't use your iTunes for anything, but you have an Apple account, or don't, it takes 5 seconds to make one. Just throw up a quick review, 5 stars, unless you really hate us, then I guess don't. But
put something on us. We just want to make the conversation bigger so that we can bring in more ideas.
Yeah. So please do that. And thanks, as always, for listening. I have been your host, Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And I'm Geoff Moonen, and happy gaming.